Should you turn up your ISO in low light conditions? Should you change your ISO at all, or should you stay at the base ISO of a modern Sony camera? And it depends on whether you shoot in RAW or log or in Rec. 709. Let's first look at log. For this test I made a small set that is divided into 3 separate areas. The first area is exposed correctly at ISO 800 and f2.8. The middle one is underexposed by 5 stops, and the right one here is overexposed by 5 stops. I now record while being at the base ISO of 800 clips at ISO 200, 400, 800, 1600 and 3200. In post-production I can adjust the exposure of all clips to look nearly identical to the recording at the base ISO of 800. It doesn't matter whether a clip was recorded at ISO 200 or at ISO 3200. You don't gain or lose any details in the highlights or shadows when adjusting the ISO. It's a different story when we're not shooting in log but in Rec. 709. Here it's immediately noticeable that at ISO 800 the bright parts of the image are overexposed and no information can be retrieved. And here again changing the exposure in post on the S-Log clip. On the side-by-side the difference and the advantage of S-Log should be clear. At ISO 400 more details can be seen, and when we look at recordings at higher ISOs we see more details in the shadows, but lose information in the highlights. So it can actually be advantageous to increase the ISO in darker scenes. Here you can see me changing the exposure in post for the Rec. 709 clip, and the same thing for the S-Log clip. But why then can we adjust the ISO at all in log? It helps us to get an impression of how different exposures, which we could make in post-production, look. It's like a monitor LUT, which allows us to view a normal, visible image, but in this case the ISO provides a preview of over or underexposure. We can now make use of that knowledge if we, for example, want to record a dark scene like this, where all the details in the backgrounds are darker than our main subject in the foreground, which is perfectly exposed at f2.8 and ISO 800. Here in the background in the details you can see there is a certain amount of noise and we can get rid of it. I now have to somehow bring in more light, be it by bringing in physically more light, opening the aperture or changing the shutter speed. I'll now open the iris from 2.8 to 1.4 and you can see it gets brighter, and now we have overexposed our image by 2 stops. I can now lower the exposure in post by 2 stops and you'll see that in the background in those darker details we have less noise than before, although the brightness is the exact same. And changing the ISO in the camera is basically bringing down the exposure by 2 stops in post. Let me change that in the camera real quick. So going down to ISO 200, here you go. So that works great if your scene is fairly dark and there is unused space in the upper part of your dynamic range. But if there are parts in your image that use that dynamic range up there, we lose all the details. So if I now go back to my f2.8 at ISO 800, you can see I can bring back those highlights. In essence, this means if you're shooting with a camera in RAW or with a good log profile that can capture the entire possible dynamic range of a sensor, then in most cases it doesn't matter which ISO you set. You're not really changing the exposure with the ISO, but rather where the midpoint inside your dynamic range sits. In dark scenes it is advisable to overexpose, which means lowering the ISO to capture more details in those darker areas without noise. And if we have a dark scene like this, where we would need ISO 3200 and we can't turn our lights up, we can go to our second ISO. And in this case, if we don't have much highlights information, we have again space in the upper half of our dynamic range, we can stay at ISO 12,800 and simply turn it down in post, or as a preview inside the camera to 3,200. We can see there is way less noise than before. And if we have important highlight information, we can bring in, of course, ND filters. And just for fun, the 10-year-old Arri Alexa in RAW, ProRes, it doesn't matter what you set, so it's the same there. Interestingly, with Blackmagic, yes, it is the same, but if you take a look at the highlights, the Arri and the Sony have a clear advantage with the Blackmagic. The very high exposed highlights are very desaturated and lose colors, which the others don't.